I'm here to tell you that cellulite has a drainage component, meaning one of the drainage pathways isn't working properly when cellulite is present. Now, I'm a little nervous about talking about this topic. Why? Because I don't want anybody to feel like I am shaming them or body shaming or trying to make anybody uncomfortable with their body's appearance. That is by no way, shape, or form the intention of this video. The intention of this video is to share with you what research is finding that's contributing to cellulite, because there might be some bigger implications going on under the surface that might need your attention so that they don't become bigger problems in the future. So again, this has zero to do with the actual appearance of cellulite and more to do what's going on under the surface. All right, with that being said, let's dive in and let's start talking about what the contributing factors to cellulite are. One of the first things that is contributing to that appearance of like the dimpling in the skin, almost like that cottage cheese-like appearance, is the connective tissue under your skin. So what happens is the connective tissue is holding the layer of fat, and changes in connective tissue ultimately allow the fat to come through and create this like bubbly, loby type look to the skin's appearance. Now, those bands of connective tissue are actually different in men and women, which is why women tend to have more cellulite than men do. I know, it's so unfortunate. In women, our bands are vertical. And so when fat expands and it pushes upwards against those vertical connective tissue, it can create that cottage cheese-like effect. Whereas in men, they have more of a crisscross look versus the vertical. So it prevents the fat from coming through the connective tissue, which is why men have less occurrences of cellulite. No, totally not fair. So some of the root causes for the changes in collagen is, one is going to be aging, but here's the thing. Aging is part of it, but there's things we can do to slow the aging process down. So making sure that you're hydrated is super important, because when we're dehydrated, it is going to change the functionality of the collagen. Another problem is injury to the area. So with the fascia, I want you to think of like a sleeve on a sausage, right? Like the sausage sleeve. What it does is it ultimately encapsulates like muscles and different like tissues. And what it's supposed to do is it's supposed to allow a smooth gliding surface. Well, what can happen is when damage happens to the fascia, it ultimately doesn't allow this smooth glide. It becomes like sticky and it doesn't move very freely. And so breaking up the fascia and the connective tissue is going to be important. So some of the ways that you can address that would be going and getting work done by a professional. It may be a form like Graston. They may be even using a tool like gua sha, because actually gua sha, guys, is meant for like muscles and fascial adhesions. It's not really meant for like the moving the lymphatic fluid that is such like hot trend right now. But breaking up those adhesions is going to help with it laying flatter. The other thing that you may want to like consider is increasing your vitamin C to help with the fascia, or even using like a vitamin C like topical lotion kind of thing. So that's the first thing, is having weak connective tissue. Okay, the second component is lymphatic drainage. So when we have poor circulation and lymphatic drainage, because remember, those two go hand in hand, they're mirrors of one another. When we have poor circulation, we're going to have poor lymphatic drainage. When we have poor lymphatic drainage, we're going to end up having circulation issues as well. They do go hand in hand. So if we do not have proper lymphatic drainage, and a lot of times when we look at cellulite happens in our butt, in our thighs, and when we think about that, lymphatic drainage from our belly button down only drains if we are diaphragmatic breathing. That's the only way that we're going to get proper, actual, like full-on drainage. And so if we're not getting really good lymphatic drainage, what happens is that waste fluid sits there, and the waste fluid causes inflammation, and that inflammation causes breakdown. So lymphatic drainage is super duper important. So I always incorporate lymphatic drainage when we're addressing cellulite. So making sure that you're clearing your lymph nodes, your specific 7, making sure you're diaphragmatic breathing, making sure you're not sitting for extended periods of time, because guess what? Our inguinal or groin lymph nodes get compressed, and then that lymphatic fluid isn't able to drain very well. And then the other thing would be making sure that we're not wearing super tight clothing around our waist or really, really tight underwear that might be restricting lymphatic drainage. So that is number 2, is having improper lymphatic drainage. Part of that goes into this next component, which is inflammation and fat cell expansion. So what that means is when we have inflammation, inflammation ultimately drives the breakdown of tissues. So that breakdown of tissues could be the connective tissue, it could be the collagen, it could be just the elasticity of the tissues, it could be even the lymphatic vessels hindering lymphatic drainage. So inflammation is a big component. The fat cell expansion happens a lot of times because of inflammation. It can be an inflammatory response. So having things like chronic inflammation due to things like processed foods, sugars, stress, alcohol, poor sleep, like the list goes on and on as to what contributes to inflammation or what causes inflammation. But all of those things, like inflammation, is going to cause your fat cells to swell and ultimately stiffen. So when they swell, it causes issues within the connective tissue. Now, inflamed tissues will also retain more water and toxins. So one of the things that our body does is it sequesters toxins in fat. So if your lymph system isn't draining, remember our lymphatic system is the sewage system of our body. If that's not draining properly, what's going to happen is your body's going to want to sequester and store some of those toxins in fat cells. And as the fat cells become fuller and fuller and fuller, they become bigger and bigger and bigger, which then means more of the fat cells is pushing against that connective tissue, causing more to bubble through. So making sure that we are reducing our inflammatory response by looking at where's our inflammation coming from is going to be really important. And that's going to differ per person. Everybody's going to have a different cause as to why or what their body is responding to inflammatory wise. So that would be the other thing I always look into. Now, as we're talking about like fat and like toxins being stored in fat, one of the craziest things is cellulite prone areas tend to accumulate more xenoestrogens, plasticizers, pesticides, and heavy metals. So looking at your toxic load is going to be really important too. And reducing your toxic exposure is also going to be important for slowing down how quickly cellulite progresses. So, replacing those plastic bottles with glass or even a stainless steel, not warming up food in the microwave in plastic containers, making sure that, when you can, if you can do organic, doing organic to reduce your pesticides exposure, not spraying your grass with pesticides, looking at like what you're putting on your body, like what lotions, what body wash, what makeup, because what we put on our body gets absorbed into our body. And so all of those toxins, like I mentioned, get stored in fat cells when they can't be broken down. Now, let's talk about why they might not be able to be broken down. Is it could be a liver problem. So what happens too with cellulite is there's usually an estrogen imbalance. Now, this is another reason why this happens more commonly in women than in men. Is in women, we have more fluctuations in our hormones, especially around like puberty, pregnancy, perimenopause, and menopause. So our estrogens and our progesterones are going to fluctuate. And so if we have an estrogen imbalance, what's going to happen is estrogen increases the amount of fat being deposited, especially in the glutes and thighs. So if we have those estrogen imbalances, one, we should get it checked out to see if we do have an estrogen imbalance. My favorite test is the Dutch test because it's actually looking at all of the metabolites and it's not just looking at what's bound in blood at that very second. So Dutch test is going to be far more inclusive as to see like what exactly is happening. Now, why that's important is because if we have more estrogen than we're supposed to and we're not getting rid of it, like our liver's not breaking it down via phase 1 and phase 2 detoxification pathways, that estrogen can become problematic, meaning our body can start to convert it into bad estrogens, which can then be more problematic for like causing DNA damage, being more prone to cancers, things like that. So it's always a good idea to see what type of estrogen you have and what is your body doing with it. Is it getting rid of it? Now, when we don't get rid of estrogen, we end up having more more hormonal issues as well. So I see this a lot with individuals who have really bad PMS, really bad menstrual cycle, endometriosis, PCOS. All of those things tend to be very heightened when our estrogen levels are out of whack. So getting a good understanding of what's happening with our estrogen is also very important. Another huge component is I see a lot of women, we end up developing cellulite a little later on in life. It's not usually in our 20s. And I'm not saying that it doesn't happen in our 20s or in our teens, but it usually happens closer to perimenopause, which is closer to those hormonal changes with estrogen. And part of that too goes hand in hand with muscle loss. So one of the things that we do need to do in order to decrease the appearance of cellulite is to increase the muscle tone in those areas. So yes, that means we do need to lift weights, guys. Squatting, lunges, like lifting weights is really important in order to build muscle. And so some of the really beneficial things too is even on a treadmill, walking at an incline but backwards. Walking backwards will activate different muscles. Make sure you're going at a safe speed though, okay? You're not doing running backwards, or at least not to start with. And if you are, you're my hero. But doing things that's going to build muscles, like I said, the glutes, the quads, the hamstrings is going to be really important. And why muscle loss? So you might be like, well, what the heck? How does muscle have to do with this? Well, having a sedentary lifestyle. So when we sit too much, what happens is we end up having much less muscle tone, which then means less capillary flow, so less blood flow, which then means more pressure on lymph. So remember, those two go hand in hand. And so what happens is we need to create that strong muscle, because it's ultimately the base structure underneath the skin, which is then going to reduce the appearance of that dimpling. And building muscles is not just going to be beneficial for reducing the appearance of cellulite, but it's also going to be beneficial for overall health and wellness, not to mention bone density and so much more. Another component, the last one we're going to talk about, is the genetic factor. But here's the thing. Whenever I hear people saying, well, it's in my genes, I'd love you to look into the epigenetics. Bruce Lipton wrote an amazing book, The Biology of Belief, that talks about epigenetics and how our environment actually controls expressions of genes. So the way that he explains it is our genes are a loaded gun. But what happens is our lifestyle, our environmental factors is what pulls the trigger. So if our toxic load is really high, if our inflammation is really high, if our stress level is really high, if we live a sedentary lifestyle, if our liver isn't breaking down estrogens and clearing them properly, all of those things are going to make us more likely to develop cellulite versus, my mom had it kind of thing. So I do understand that it can run in families, but what else runs in families? Lifestyle, what we do, how we respond to stress, what we eat, which can drive inflammation. So yes, that can be a factor, but that will only contribute to about 5 to 10% of cellulite cases is the genetic component. So that means we have 90 to 95% control over what is happening. So a couple things that you can do in order to help, like I said, control this would be to break down those fascial adhesions, make sure that the collagen is nice and strong. So being hydrated, lymphatic congestion, making sure that we're getting up and moving, that we're clearing our specific 7. You may need to do things like vibration or rebounding or dry brushing to make sure the lymphatic fluid in the vessels is clearing. If we have estrogen dominance, we got to take a look at our liver and find out what our liver is or is not doing, and then help support liver. So you may need to take things like DIM, or you may need to increase your cruciferous vegetables, or you may need to take things like milk thistle, but it really depends on what part of the liver isn't functioning ideally. If you have toxic accumulation, you've been exposed to a ton of toxins and those are sitting within your fat cells, making sure that you're reducing your toxic exposure. So like I said, reducing the plastics, wearing more healthy clothing like cotton, linen, making sure that we're maybe doing additional things like getting in a sauna to sweat a little bit more, maybe taking things like glutathione, which is our body's natural antioxidant, taking binders to make sure that those toxins aren't going to be redistributed or recirculating, like we want them to come out, looking at where our inflammation is coming from. So if our inflammation is due to stress, what can we do stress management wise? Is it due to a past trauma? Can we maybe do somato exercises? Do we need to do vagal tone? Like, what do we need to do? Poor circulation would be very similar to lymphatic drainage. So getting like on the rebound or the vibration plate, dry brushing, all those things are fantastic. And then making sure that what we put on and in our body is as clean as possible. Again, I hope this was helpful. And just to give you guys some direction to look as to what may be contributing to cellulite, as it's not a one thing across the board for everybody. Everybody's a little bit unique. But I hope more than ever that you understand that if there is cellulite present, we really should be looking into lymph, liver, and toxic load as well. Thank you so much for being here. And as always, happy draining.